December 16th, 1944. 5:30 in the morning, the Ardennes forest. Snow fell in thick curtains across the Belgian countryside, muffling sound, erasing horizons. In the pre-dawn darkness, German soldiers crouched in their assembly positions could see their breath crystallize in the frozen air. They wore white camouflage smocks over their field-gray uniforms, blending into the winter landscape like ghosts preparing to haunt the living. The forest smelled of pine sap and diesel fuel, of wet wool and nervous sweat. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, then fell silent, as if sensing what was about to unfold. The men of the 6th Panzer Army had been told this would be their moment of redemption, after months of retreat across France, after the catastrophic losses in Normandy, after watching their fatherland's borders shrink week by week under the relentless Allied advance. They had been promised one final chance to turn the tide. Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. A thrust through the weakest point in the American line, a drive to Antwerp that would split the Allied armies in two, encircle 4 entire armies, and force the Western powers to negotiate a separate peace. Their commanders had assured them the Americans were soft, poorly trained, dependent on material abundance rather than warrior spirit. The officers spoke with contempt about American soldiers who required hot meals and regular mail delivery, who complained about discomfort, who lacked the ideological fire that had carried the Wehrmacht across Europe in 1940. The Americans, they said, would break easily under determined assault. They always had before. In the command posts behind the German lines, the generals studied their maps with satisfaction. They had achieved complete surprise. 25 divisions, over 200,000 men, had been assembled in absolute secrecy. The Americans opposite them were green troops, new arrivals sent to a quiet sector to gain experience, or exhausted veterans pulled back to rest after the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen forest. The weather had grounded Allied aircraft. The terrain favored the defender, but the Germans would not be defending. They would be attacking with the fury of men who knew this was their last chance. At precisely 5:30, the German artillery opened fire. 1,600 guns spoke as one, their muzzle flashes lighting the snow-covered forest like 1,000 lightning strikes compressed into a single moment. The sound was not merely loud. It was physical, a pressure wave that pushed against the chest, that made the ground tremble, that turned the air itself into something solid and crushing. For 90 minutes, the barrage continued, shells screaming across the winter sky to fall upon American positions that had been peaceful just moments before. When the guns finally fell silent, the German infantry advanced. They moved with the confidence of men who had done this before, who had broken armies from Warsaw to Paris, from Oslo to Athens. Behind them came the panzers, the heavy tanks that had once seemed invincible, their engines roaring in the cold morning air. The snow continued to fall, and the Germans pushed forward into the white silence, certain that the Americans ahead of them were already beaten. For the first hours, it seemed their confidence was justified. American positions were overrun. Entire companies were surrounded and forced to surrender. The roads west filled with American vehicles fleeing in disorder. By nightfall on the first day, the Germans had penetrated up to 5 miles into American lines at some points. Radio intercepts revealed panic in American communications. The breakthrough was real. In the German command posts, the generals allowed themselves to smile. It was 1940 again. The Americans were doing exactly what the French had done, collapsing in confusion, unable to respond to the speed and violence of German mobile warfare. The road to Antwerp seemed open, but something was different this time, something the German generals had not accounted for in their planning, had not understood despite 4 years of fighting the Western Allies. The Americans were not retreating in panic. They were retreating to better positions, and as they fell back, they were calling for artillery support with a precision and efficiency that would have seemed impossible to any army that had fought in the First World War. The American artillery system in 1944 was not merely a collection of guns. It was an integrated network of observation, communication, and fire direction that represented a revolution in warfare as profound as the tank or the aircraft. At its heart was a simple innovation: the Fire Direction Center, a small group of men with radios, maps, and calculating devices who could coordinate the fire of dozens of batteries across miles of front line, bringing hundreds of guns to bear on a single target within minutes. The Germans had nothing comparable. German artillery in 1944 operated much as it had in 1918. Each battery fought its own battle, responding to requests from nearby infantry, firing at targets it could observe directly or that were reported through slow, cumbersome communication channels. Coordinating the fire of multiple batteries required time, required written orders passed through proper channels, required a level of centralized control that was impossible in the chaos of mobile warfare. The Americans had solved this problem through a combination of technology and doctrine that the Germans had dismissed as unnecessary complexity. Every American artillery battery had radio communication with forward observers attached to the infantry. Every forward observer could call for fire not just from his own battery, but from any battery in range. Every fire direction center could compute firing solutions in seconds using standardized procedures and mechanical calculators. And every gun crew had been trained to a level of proficiency that seemed almost wasteful to European military minds, trained until they could service their weapons with mechanical precision, trained until 15 rounds per minute was not a theoretical maximum, but a sustainable rate of fire. The German generals knew the Americans had more guns. That was simply a fact of industrial capacity. America could build more of everything. But they had assumed that quantity could not substitute for quality, that American gun crews would be as poorly trained as they imagined American infantry to be, that American artillery would be as slow and unresponsive as their own. They were catastrophically wrong. On December 17th, the second day of the offensive, the German 12th SS Panzer Division attempted to exploit a breakthrough near Krinkelt-Rocherath. The twin villages sat astride a critical road junction, and their capture would open the way for the panzers to reach the Meuse River. The Americans holding the villages were from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions, units that had been in the line when the offensive began. They had fallen back to the villages and were now preparing to make a stand. The SS troops advanced with the arrogance of an elite formation that had never known defeat. They had fought in Normandy, had held against British and Canadian attacks that had ground up entire divisions. They considered themselves the finest soldiers in the world, and they expected the Americans to run. Instead, the Americans called for artillery. The first shells arrived within 3 minutes of the request. Not a ranging shot, not a tentative probe, but a full battery firing for effect. 6 guns, firing in unison, their shells arriving in a pattern that covered the German assembly area with high explosive and white phosphorus. Before the German company commander could react, before he could order his men to disperse or take cover, a second battery joined the first, then a third. Within 5 minutes, 18 guns were firing on a target area no larger than a football field. The German attack stalled before it truly began. Men who had survived Normandy, who had endured the heaviest bombardments the British could deliver, found themselves in a maelstrom of fire unlike anything they had experienced. The shells came not in waves, not in the rhythmic pattern of traditional artillery fire, but in a continuous roar, a sustained thunder that gave no respite, no moment to recover, no chance to advance or retreat. The snow-covered ground erupted in fountains of frozen earth and shattered trees. The air filled with steel fragments moving faster than sound. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fire shifted. Not stopped, shifted. The shells that had been falling on the German assembly area now walked forward, creating a moving wall of explosions that advanced ahead of the American defensive positions. Any German soldier who had survived the initial barrage and tried to continue the attack now ran directly into this curtain of steel. Those who tried to retreat found the fire shifting back, catching them in the open. This was not artillery as the Germans understood it. This was something new, something that transformed the battlefield into a space where movement itself became impossible, where the initiative passed entirely to whoever controlled the guns. The SS division tried again and again. Each time the American artillery responded with the same devastating precision. By nightfall, the twin villages remained in American hands, and the road junction was blocked. The German timetable, which had assumed rapid breakthrough and exploitation, was already falling behind schedule. In the German command posts, the reports were read with growing concern. The Americans were fighting harder than expected. That was troublesome, but not catastrophic. Determined resistance could be overcome with sufficient force. What was truly alarming was the artillery. The sheer volume of fire, the speed of response, the accuracy of the targeting. German units reported being hit by artillery within minutes of being spotted. Commanders reported that American fire seemed to follow their movements, that concentrations of troops drew immediate bombardment, that even small groups moving in the open were engaged by multiple batteries. The German generals consulted their intelligence files. The Americans, they knew, had the M2A1 105mm howitzer as their standard divisional artillery piece. It was a good gun, modern and reliable, but not exceptional. The Germans had comparable weapons. What they could not understand was how the Americans were using them with such effect. The answer lay not in the gun itself, but in everything surrounding it. The M2A1 could fire 15 rounds per minute in the hands of a well-trained crew. Not for a few minutes, but sustainably, for as long as ammunition lasted. German guns of similar caliber could manage 4 to 6 rounds per minute. The American gun had a split trail carriage that allowed rapid traverse, letting the crew shift targets without repositioning the entire weapon. German guns required more time to adjust. The American gun was towed by a truck that could move it quickly from position to position. German guns were increasingly pulled by horses, as fuel shortages bit deeper into Wehrmacht logistics. But the real difference was not mechanical. It was human. American gun crews had trained together for months before deploying to Europe. They had fired thousands of practice rounds, had drilled until every movement was automatic, until the gun could be brought into action in minutes and serviced with assembly line efficiency. The Germans, by late 1944, were feeding replacements into depleted units, men who had received abbreviated training, who learned their craft under fire rather than on practice ranges. And behind the gun crews were the forward observers, young officers and sergeants who moved with the infantry, who could call down fire with a radio message that took seconds to transmit. And behind the forward observers were the fire direction centers, where officers plotted targets on maps and calculated firing solutions with mechanical precision. And behind all of it was an industrial system that could deliver ammunition in quantities that seemed limitless, that could replace worn barrels and damaged equipment faster than they could be destroyed, that could sustain a rate of fire that would have bankrupted any European army within weeks. The Germans had built an army around the concept of quality over quantity, of superior training and ideological commitment overcoming material disadvantage. They had assumed the Americans would fight the same way, that American artillery would be constrained by the same limitations that constrained their own. They had not understood that the Americans had built a different kind of military entirely, one that treated firepower as a substitute for casualties, that used industrial abundance to save lives rather than simply to produce more weapons. On December 19th, the weather began to clear. Allied aircraft returned to the skies, and the German offensive, already behind schedule, began to face a new dimension of firepower. But even before the aircraft arrived, even in the snow and fog that had grounded the plains, the American artillery had been doing its work. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division and attached units found themselves surrounded by German forces. The town was a critical road junction, and its capture was essential to the German plan. The Germans expected the encircled Americans to surrender. Surrounded troops, cut off from supply, facing overwhelming force, had no other rational choice. But the Americans at Bastogne were not cut off from their artillery. The guns of the 101st's Organic Artillery battalions were inside the perimeter, and they had ammunition. More importantly, they had communication with the outside world, and they could call for fire from guns beyond the German encirclement. The fire direction centers could plot targets reported from inside Bastogne and coordinate fire from batteries miles away, bringing shells down on German positions with the same precision as if the observers and guns were side by side. The German attacks on Bastogne were met with a volume of fire that seemed impossible for an encircled force. Every approach route was covered by pre-plotted concentrations. Every assembly area was engaged before the attack could begin. The Germans found themselves fighting not just the troops in the town, but an artillery system that extended far beyond the visible battlefield. On December 22nd, when the German commanders sent a delegation under flag of truce to demand surrender, the American commander's reply was brief: "Nuts." The message was delivered, and the German delegation withdrew in confusion. The attacks continued. The artillery continued to answer. By Christmas Day, the German offensive had clearly failed. The deepest penetration had reached within 4 miles of the Meuse River, but no German unit had crossed it. The critical road junctions remained in American hands, the timetable was shattered, and everywhere along the front, German commanders were reporting the same thing. The American artillery made movement impossible, made concentration of forces suicidal, made any attack a journey into a storm of steel that never seemed to end. The German generals, studying their maps in headquarters that were now themselves under threat from American counterattacks, began to understand what they had missed. They had calculated American strength in terms of divisions, of tanks, of aircraft. They had not understood that American strength lay in systems, in the integration of observation and communication and fire direction that turned individual guns into a single, responsive weapon that could reach across the entire battlefield. The 105mm howitzer, which they had dismissed as merely adequate, had become in American hands something far more deadly than its specifications suggested, not because the gun itself was exceptional, but because it was part of a system that multiplied its effectiveness 100-fold. 15 rounds per minute meant nothing if those rounds fell on empty ground. But 15 rounds per minute, directed by forward observers who could see the target, coordinated by fire direction centers that could mask the fire of dozens of guns, sustained by a logistics system that could deliver ammunition faster than it could be fired. That was something new in warfare, something the Germans had no answer for. In the village of Bastogne, a German officer who survived the battle wrote in his diary about the American artillery. He described it not as a weapon, but as a presence, something that seemed to be everywhere at once, that responded to every movement, that made the battlefield itself hostile. He wrote that his men had learned to fear the sound of American radio traffic more than the sight of American tanks, because the radios meant the artillery was being called, and the artillery meant death arrived in seconds rather than minutes. This was not the fear of a coward. This was the recognition of a professional soldier that he was facing something his training had not prepared him for, something his experience could not counter. The German army had built its doctrine around mobility, around the rapid concentration of force at decisive points. The American artillery made concentration impossible. Any gathering of troops, any assembly of vehicles, any movement in the open drew immediate fire. The Germans found themselves dispersed, unable to mass for attack, unable to exploit the few successes they achieved because movement itself had become too costly. The symbolism was not lost on those who survived to reflect on it. The German army had prided itself on its warrior ethos, on the superiority of the individual soldier, on the triumph of will over material. The Americans had answered with a system that removed the individual from the equation, that made courage and determination irrelevant in the face of industrial firepower. It was a very American way of war, impersonal, efficient, overwhelming. It valued the lives of its own soldiers enough to substitute steel for blood. It had the industrial capacity to make that substitution real. By early January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German army had been pushed back to its starting positions, having lost over 100,000 men, 800 tanks, and 1,000 aircraft it could not replace. The Americans had suffered heavily as well, nearly 90,000 casualties, but the difference was that American losses could be replaced. More men, more tanks, more guns, more ammunition flowed across the Atlantic in an endless stream. The German reserves were exhausted. In the final accounting, historians would note many factors in the German defeat: the weather clearing and allowing Allied air power to intervene, the stubborn defense of key positions like Bastogne and St. Vith, the rapid response of American armored divisions that counterattacked the German flanks. All of these were important. But the foundation of the defense, the element that made everything else possible, was the artillery. The guns that the German generals had dismissed as adequate, operated by crews they had assumed would be poorly trained, coordinated by a system they had not understood existed, had stopped the last German offensive of the war. Not through any single dramatic action, not through heroic last stands or brilliant tactical maneuvers, but through the steady, relentless application of firepower that made German success impossible. The 105mm howitzer would remain in American service for decades after the war, a testament to its design. But its true legacy was not the gun itself. It was the system that surrounded it, the integration of observation and communication and fire direction that transformed artillery from a supporting arm into a dominant force on the battlefield. Other armies would study the American system and attempt to replicate it, but replication required more than copying procedures. It required a level of training, a quality of communication equipment, a quantity of ammunition, and an industrial base that few nations possessed. The German generals who had ridiculed American firepower learned their lesson in the forests of the Ardennes, in the snow-covered fields of Belgium, in the ruins of villages that had become fortresses not through their walls, but through the umbrella of steel that American artillery could place over them. They learned that modern war was not won by the courage of individual soldiers, however great, but by systems that could deliver overwhelming force with precision and speed. The lesson came too late for the Third Reich. By the time the German commanders understood what they were facing, they no longer had the resources to counter it. The armies that had conquered Europe in 1940 through speed and shock were ground down in 1944 and 1945 by an enemy that fought differently, that valued efficiency over glory, that used abundance as a weapon in itself. In the end, the thunder of the guns spoke a truth that ideology could not answer. Democracy, with all its inefficiencies and debates and compromises, had produced a military system that totalitarianism, with all its focus and discipline and sacrifice, could not match. Not because democratic soldiers were braver. Courage was common to both sides. But because democratic society had created an industrial and organizational capacity that could translate resources into combat power with devastating effectiveness. The 105mm howitzer firing 15 rounds per minute was not just a weapon. It was a statement. It said that American society valued its soldiers' lives enough to protect them with steel rather than spend them in futile charges. It said that American industry could produce ammunition in quantities that made sustained fire possible. It said that American military doctrine trusted junior officers and sergeants with the authority to call down that fire without waiting for permission from distant headquarters. It said that American training could turn ordinary citizens into gun crews capable of mechanical precision under fire. The German generals had ridiculed these things because they did not fit their understanding of war. They had built an army around the concept of the superior warrior, the man whose training and ideology made him worth 10 of the enemy. They had not understood that their enemy had built an army around a different concept entirely. That the purpose of military force was not to prove superiority, but to accomplish objectives, and that objectives could be accomplished more efficiently through firepower than through sacrifice. The snow in the Ardennes eventually melted. The forests grew back. The villages were rebuilt. The guns fell silent. But the lesson remained, written in the records of units destroyed, in the diaries of survivors, in the calculations of historians who would study the battle for generations. 15 rounds per minute. It seemed like such a small thing, a technical specification, a number in a manual. But in the hands of trained crews, coordinated by an integrated system, sustained by industrial abundance, those 15 rounds per minute became the difference between victory and defeat, between a German breakthrough that might have prolonged the war and a German disaster that hastened its end. The generals who had ridiculed American firepower were silent now, their armies destroyed, their nation in ruins. The guns that had answered their attack stood as monuments to a different way of war, a way that valued life over glory, efficiency over heroism, systems over individuals. It was not a romantic vision of warfare. It was not the stuff of legends and songs, but it was effective. And in the end, effectiveness was all that mattered. The thunder that had rolled across the Ardennes in December 1944 was not just the sound of guns firing. It was the sound of one vision of warfare destroying another, of industrial democracy proving itself superior to militaristic totalitarianism not through moral superiority alone, but through the practical application of resources and organization and training. It was the sound of the future, of wars that would be won not by the bravest soldiers but by the most effective systems. And it began with a gun that could fire 15 rounds per minute, in the hands of crews who had been trained to do exactly that, coordinated by a system that the enemy had not understood until it was too late. The lesson of the Bulge was simple. Never mistake abundance for weakness, never confuse efficiency for lack of courage. Never assume that an enemy who values the lives of their soldiers will fight less effectively than one who spends them freely. The Americans had proven that the opposite was true, that an army that protected its soldiers with firepower could fight harder and longer than one that relied on sacrifice. It was a lesson written in steel and fire, in the snow-covered forests of Belgium, in the winter of 1944, and it echoed long after the guns fell silent.